while they're building up their little thug state within the state, they are issuing hypocritical orders to the army that the army shouldn't have to put up with orders and stuff. But they didn't institute that in their little clique, did they? Not at all. Quote, the provisional government lasted approximately 8 months, from March 12th until November 7th, 1917. A large part of its failure stemmed from the limited authority and power of the new regime. It had at all times to contend with the Soviet. It had little in the way of an effective administration apparatus, the Tsar's police in particular having largely gone into hiding, as we mentioned earlier. While the high command of the army supported the government, enlisted men remained an uncertain quantity. The Petrograd garrison itself was devoted to the Soviet. What is more, the provisional government had to promise the Soviet not to remove or disarm the garrison. Not that they could have done much without starting an armed conflict, but the government actually had to promise the Soviet that they would continue to allow that garrison to run and operate, even though it was asserting independent authority and sort of being a little thug state within the state. So one government collapsed, another government arises, then it continues the war against Germany, even though defeatism had spread among the people and the soldiers. And this new government, choosing to continue the war, has to now get an election together like the other one was trying to do to legitimize itself. Quote from page 458, when a constituent assembly finally did meet, it was much too late, for the Bolsheviks had already gained control of Russia. End quote. Now, it's pretty summary there, it goes into a little more detail, but we saw how they maintained their independence of the government, issued orders in contradiction to the government, with an armed camp, a camp of armed men, and offering things such as, here's some of Lenin's proclamations. He says that the citizens should seize the land of the gentry, peasants, that the peasants should control the factories by committees of workers, and he said all power to the Soviets, war to the palaces, peace to the huts, expropriate the expropriators. So he brings class warfare in by force. Now what's funny is, it's just like the promises to the army. You know, you should be able to elect your people and stuff like this. And they make these promises to the peasants. You'll have land, you'll have bread, you'll have freedom. And in the end, the army was disbanded. A lot of them were arrested. If they were brought into the Red Army, they had to go back into an army where you were issued orders and had to do what you were told. So that was just promises and fluff. They promised land, bread, freedom, war to the palaces, peace to the huts. What it ended up being was a war on the huts for a couple of generations. A civil war in which the people, the long-term civil war, I mean not the shooting and fighting civil war, but long-term statism is just a civil war of one group against another. So it's weird, it's interesting, it's double-speak, it's everything. I mean, it's like George Orwell must have studied this and known all about this, the way they say these things. Peace, bread, freedom, and it becomes an internal war, and people starve to death, and it's slavery in chains. So, by promising a bunch of things that weren't true and weren't going to happen, and directly contradicting themselves in action by practicing one thing and preaching another, and by using guns and force, the Soviets slowly took over Russia while the provisional government was muddling about trying to get itself legitimized, trying to get itself together. Now, there was a scandal called the July Days, from the 16th to the 18th of July in 1917, when there was a big mob together with Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik Communist Soviets we think of. They tried to seize power in Petrograd. It's the one thing for them to be issuing orders, and they've got a garrison there, but they tried to just kick out the government and say, this is our city now. Lenin, quote, apparently considered the uprising premature, and the Bolsheviks seemed to follow their impatient adherents as much as they led them. Meaning there was this large unruly mob, and the Bolsheviks were hangers-on and stuff, but Lenin didn't think it was time to assert their authority. Although sizable and threatening, the rebellion collapsed because the Soviet refused to endorse it. Some military units proved loyal to the provisional government, and because the government utilized the German connections of the Bolsheviks to accuse them of treason. Now, that's serious. They didn't have total control of the country yet. They've got their armed camp, but they're accused of treason, and Bolshevik leaders, quote, fled, including Lenin, who went to Finland, from whence he continued to direct the party. Certain others were jailed, but the government did not press its victory and tried to eliminate its opponents. In fact, later on, they let them out of jail. So they were charged with treason and got in a bit of trouble, and Lenin himself fled. Now, this is at a point where they basically they basically have control of Russia. They have power in Russia. Not really. It's going to take years to establish that, but essentially, when Lenin has to flee, they've already got quite a lot of power. The Soviets, as we now think of them, were pretty well established. Now, the provisional government that has to check with the Soviets for everything it does is getting a lot of flack from the people who are mad about the lenient treatment of the Bolsheviks. A lot of people are saying to the provisional government, you've got to destroy the Bolshevik party. If we're going to have this democracy work, we can't be having these thugs owning this city, giving it orders and stuff. So there were people speaking out against it, but there was this one guy. Here you get an idea of the idealism of the people arrayed against the Bolsheviks. Kerensky, we're coming from Sheila Fitzpatrick's book, The Russian Revolution. Kerensky, despite an exalted sense of his mission to save Russia, was essentially a go-between and negotiator of political compromise, not greatly trusted or respected, and lacking a political base in any of the major parties, as he sadly complained. Quote, now this is a guy who's in the upper echelons of Russian power, and at one point is trying to make the government go his way under what he wants to have happen. Quote, I struggle with the Bolsheviks of the left and the Bolsheviks of the right, but people demand that I lean on one or the other. I want to make a middle road, but no one will help me. So he says there's people with views over there and over here, and I just want to be with everybody. I don't want to disagree with anyone. I want everyone to get along, he says. Just proof that these people exist. They are out there. People that think we can all just get along. And the problem with that, it's lovely. I love kindergarten as much as anyone else, but the problem is someone always shows up with a gun and tries to get something from you by force. And you can't get along with them. You can't. That's why you have to have police and military and courts and jails. Now, this guy, General Kornilov, let's talk about him. This is a run-up act to the Civil War. General Kornilov was appointed the commander-in-chief, and he was Cossack origin, and his desire was to restore the old regime. Quote, he wanted above all to reestablish discipline in the army and law and order in the country, disapproving especially of the activities of the Soviets. Now, he didn't have an axe to grind philosophically so much as just he thought, well, things used to be orderly, let's go back and do it that way, and let's not let the Soviets keep doing what they're doing, most particularly. So he decides to try to take over the provisional government, which is the one half of the government. The Soviets are sort of like the other half of this government that's clashing. He tries to take it over. From the 9th to the 14th of September, the population of the capital mobilized for defense. So here he comes with his troops, his advancing troops. The troops, quote, faced a railroad strike, encountering general opposition, and short of supplies, became demoralized and bogged down without reaching the destination. So the people of Russia, including the railroad striking and people just opposing the army as it marched, stopped them from taking or even trying to take over the provisional government. Their commanding officer committed suicide. Interesting.